The Amazing Christmas Extravaganza by David Shannon. It all started with one little string of tiny white Christmas lights. In the past, Mr. Merriweather had been happy celebrating Christmas with his wife and their children, Matthew and Sarah. Each year, he made a big show of getting the box of ornaments down from the attic. Then, the Merriweather family decorated the tree together and hung a wreath on the front door. But this Christmas was different. This year, we're really going to celebrate Christmas, he announced. This year, we're going to put lights on the house. They were all very excited. Mrs. Merriweather clapped her hands and Sarah hopped on one foot. Then Mr. Merriweather hauled his ladder outside and tacked up a small string of white lights around the front window. "That's fine," he said, admiring his handiwork. He left the lights on all night so he could see the glow from his bedroom, and he went to sleep a happy man. "Kind of a shrimpy little string of lights you got there, pal." Mr. Merriweather stopped shoveling and turned to see Mr. Clack, his neighbor from across the street. "Wait till you see my lights," Mr. Clack bragged. "I got 17 strings of lights and they blink on and off." Mr. Merriweather was suddenly embarrassed. "Well, I'm not done yet." "You wait till I'm finished, then I guess you'll see something." He pulled his hat down over his ears and went back to shoveling. That afternoon, Mr. Merriweather gathered up his kids and drove the station wagon to 5 big department stores. He bought so many Christmas decorations that he couldn't close the tailgate. He could hardly wait to get home and put them all up. "Can we really afford all that?" Mrs. Merriweather asked when she saw the decorations. "Of course we can, honey," Mr. Merriweather said. "It's Christmas." That night, he peeked out his bedroom window and saw Mr. Clack staring up at the new display. He chuckled to himself when Mr. Clack kicked some snow and stomped home. The next day, all of Mr. Merriweather's neighbors stopped by to tell him how wonderful his house looked. He had never gotten so many compliments. They made him feel giddy and full inside, like he'd just eaten a big dinner. But still, he thought, there was room for improvement. Every morning for the next week, Mr. Merriweather fired up the old station wagon and went in search of more decorations, which he carefully added onto his house with the seriousness of a true artist. And every morning, the neighbors and their kids came out to see the new wonders sprouting from the House of Lights. "Magnificent!" his neighbors exclaimed. "Awesome!" Matthew's and Sarah's friends told them they were lucky to have such a great dad. "Yeah," Matthew said, a little puzzled. "He's really something." Mrs. Merriweather tried to be understanding, but she was worried. Christmas Day would be here soon, and it seemed that her husband could only think of colored lights and plastic candles. She was relieved when Mr. Merriweather told her that he'd been to every store he could find, and there was nothing left to buy. Then she heard the hammer banging, and she saw buzzing in the garage. Right now, I hope you're making a prediction of what's happening. Several days later, Mr. Merriweather unveiled what he had made. "It's truly an extravaganza," the neighbors gasped. Mr. Merriweather flipped a switch and a recording of the 12 Days of Christmas blared out of the loudspeakers. Life-size wooden cutouts filled the yard representing each of the 12 days. There were maids a-milking, geese a-laying, lords a-leaping, and even a partridge in a pear tree. "And this is nothing," shouted Mr. Merryweather. "You should see what I'm building next." "Terrific," muttered Mr. Clack. "I like celebrating Christmas as much as the next guy, but this is ridiculous." Mr. Merryweather was no longer thinking about Christmas, however. He was thinking about bigger, brighter, and more. The next night, Mr. Merryweather was back at work on his extravaganza. "You'd better come down now, dear," Mrs. Merryweather called up to him. "The children are in the Christmas program tonight." "Sorry, no time," Mr. Merryweather mumbled through a mouthful of nails. "I've got too much to do. You go on without me." It was hopeless. Mrs. Merryweather tried to explain to Matthew and Sarah that their father was a very busy man. "I think he's gone a little wacko," Matthew said. "Hush," his mother scolded. "Don't talk about your father that way." Mr. Merryweather's display continued to grow. One day he put up Santa's workshop complete with elves. The next day he had a giant snowman made of styrofoam, and finally he built a 50-foot Santa with a mechanical arm that waved. People from 3 counties away brought their children to see the now famous Merryweather front yard. But it wasn't so much fun anymore for the people who lived nearby. The extravaganza used so much electricity that there was hardly any left for the neighbors. Their Christmas trees were dim and dull, and their Christmas cookies came out doughy from ovens that wouldn't heat. The noise from the sightseers honking and yelling was so loud that the annual Christmas caroling had to be canceled. No one could hear the singers. People visiting their families got stranded for hours in the tangle of traffic. Sometimes they just gave up and went home. Mr. Merryweather didn't even notice. He sat snugly in his brightly lit home, humming along with the 12 days of Christmas. Finally, the neighbors decided something had to be done. On Christmas Eve, they held a meeting at Mr. Clack's house. "Let's call the cops," someone shouted. "Let's take them to court," screamed another. "Now, wait a minute," said Mr. Clack. "We don't want to look like a bunch of Scrooges." Just then, all the lights in the neighborhood went out. Up and down the street, everything was black. Everything, that is, except the Christmas extravaganza, which glowed brighter than ever. "That's the last straw," roared Mr. Clack. "I don't care what people think. I say we tear it down ourselves tonight." Everyone yelled in agreement. Then they armed themselves with tools of destruction and swarmed over Mr. Merryweather's front yard, slashing, bashing, and trashing everything in sight. Mr. Merryweather and his wife woke up in mid-air. "Oh my, oh no," he wailed. "What is it?" cried the children, running into the room. "I think it's an earthquake," Mr. Merryweather exclaimed. They all dove under the bed and huddled there together, listening to the terrible screeching, cracking, and thumping. It lasted all night long. Finally, the noises stopped. Mr. Merryweather poked his head out from under the bed. It was morning, Christmas morning. He ran downstairs, opened the front door, and couldn't believe what he saw. The Christmas extravaganza was gone. Yesterday, giant snowflakes, Santa Clauses, reindeer, and lights had decorated his house and yard. Now there was only a huge piling of sputtering rubble. Mr. Clack and the rest of the mob were still standing around. Their heavy breath steamed in the cold morning air. I guess that'll teach you to muck up our neighborhood, Mr. Clack sneered. Mr. Merriweather felt as if he'd been hit by a log. He could barely talk. But I was just celebrating Christmas, he said. I didn't know it bothered you. I thought you liked it. The neighbors were silent, no longer caught up in their attack. They looked at each other and began to think about what they had done, and they were ashamed. I'm sorry, Mr. Clack said sheepishly. He picked up a pair of broken reindeer antlers. Here, he said. We'll help you put it all back together again. We'll make it even better. Mr. Merriweather shook his head. No, he said. I think some nice little white lights will do just fine. He pulled the tiny string out of the smoking heap, and Mr. Clack and all the neighbors helped him tack it up around the front window. Mr. Merriweather brought out cups of hot cider, and the whole neighborhood admired Mr. Merriweather's little string of white lights, his fine tree, and his beautiful wreath. You know, Mr. Merriweather, Mr. Clack said, that truly was an amazing Christmas extravaganza. Thank you, replied Mr. Merriweather, but these are my real masterpieces. He hugged Matthew and then swung Sarah high up into the air. Mrs. Merriweather took her husband by the arm. Don't feel bad, dear, she said. Everybody should be able to celebrate Christmas in his own way, whether it's with lots of lights or none at all. Yours just got so big there wasn't room for anyone else. Well, I've learned my lesson, Mr. Merriweather said with a sigh. I guess I got carried away. I think everyone did, Mrs. Merriweather said. But I'm proud of you. I didn't know you were so artistic. Mr. Merriweather smiled. He gazed at his children, his friends, and his big mound of junk. He noticed that several large pieces of wood were still in good condition. He wondered out loud. How many days till Easter? The end.